Here for your 15 minutes of red, white, and blues. So we both care a lot about innovation, about government, about cities, about smart cities, about technology. So this is our very quick and casual way to talk about what we're thinking about this week, kind of what's in the news in a very fun and casual way. So this is not your standard kind of talking heads. It's more like chatting heads with some snark. So welcome to Red, White, and Blues. Dustin, how's your week going this week?
So far, so good. It's Friday, so you can't complain at that. So yeah, it's been a wild week of tech. We saw 4 of the big guns up on center stage for an antitrust congressional hearing. Google, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon all in the hot seat this week. And there were some really interesting kind of takeaways from it. I mean, this was a culmination of over a year worth of activity, looking at these companies under a competitive, potential competitive breakup lens, and, some standout things for me. I think one, there was a lot that was talked about around data usage, especially around, these marketplaces, these platforms, and how they're using data from, other sellers. But I think there's a lot that wasn't talked about as well. And that's kind of the purpose of, this show, is to really talk about those issues, right? And so, you look at, outside of the competition side of things and the monopoly side of things, I think there's, a lot that we still haven't determined as a society, right? Like, how should algorithms be regulated, and how do we monitor that, and how do we have transparency around it, and, what's fair and what's not fair. So that was kind of a standout thing to me, is, we focused on the very fluffy uses of data, which are still important to focus on, I think, as a society, but there's a lot deeper issues that are at stake that just aren't getting touched.
Yeah. Well, and, normally when there's public and private sector, government and tech together, I mean, kind of literally in the same room. Of course, everybody was mostly on video who was in the hot seat. And of course, the congressional members were socially distanced with masks. Thank goodness, finally. But, normally when that's the case, I'm celebrating that. But this time, it was so painful to watch. And, even beyond the tech and the important points that you bring up, which I think are, kind of the big items of our era, it's like, gosh, we still don't even know how to respect the space around emerging technology, or even our kind of emerging for some, but our reality, of course. So, people aren't treating each other with respect. And I just wish I would have been so much happier to see a more respectful dialogue between these two sectors. And what ended up happening was it was just this kind of grandstanding and gotcha. And I mean, granted, it's an antitrust hearing, so some of that comes into play, but I just think that people are already positioned to fight. And I think we have so much more work to do. These are serious issues. This is not just a campaign trail. This is not just, your 10 seconds of fame on a Twitter feed. I just think we have so much more work to do about how to establish the conversation and how to talk about these things in a respectful way. So maybe we can do our own little tiny part of that here through Red, White, and Blue.
Yeah, and I think, that's a great point around that conversation, because the dialogue between those two sides isn't really happening outside of, these formal interactions, which are automatically built up from day one to be, not necessarily the most cordial. Yeah. So I think especially around emerging tech, it's very clear that, the federal government still has these regulators still have a ways to go with their understanding of kind of the landscape and environment. They were definitely more prepared this time than they were the last.
That was impressive.
But the challenge is, these industry players that were at the table also have a role and responsibility in educating, these regulators on, not just how they think they should be regulated, but the issues that are at heart here. And I think there was a missed opportunity to really point at where they should have started the conversation around some of the deeper societal issues around AI and other things that, were just missed to kind of, as you said, grandstanding and, people just trying to be as reserved as possible. Lots of thank yous being passed, right? Lots of with the utmost respect and response, but no real meat or substance to the conversation. And we're never going to go anywhere as a society if we continue this kind of gridlock. I mean, whether or not, any of these companies get broken up, remains to be seen. I think a lot of that's going to be, hinge on the election and what happens in November. Yeah. And, it's a gridlock right now, even with the stimulus and kind of CARES and whatever the subsequent funding stream will be. But yeah, I think there's a missed opportunity. So I guess the question for us, in today's episode is, what should these parties do? What should we be talking about prior to these formal hearings?
Yeah. Well, and you know me, I have this complete obsession with the truth. So I always like to start with telling the truth about like what is the reality, and whether we like it or not, what is the reality? And the reality is that these companies are so big and so profitable. I mean, they're, for their quarterly earnings came in a day after these hearings, and they're making tons of money, but they're doing it because they're meeting a market need. Mm-hmm. They've established these platforms to engage people and be the most convenient options, where you're getting any information you want, connecting to anyone you want, anything you want, buying anything you want at the click of a button. And we as consumers have enabled that. So I think we also have to tell the truth by saying we are getting what we asked for. Now, is that what we really want? And how do we hold this in a responsible language? And how do we say we still want this level of convenience and instant 24/7 access to each other remotely and to information at any time we want? But how do we put the privacy pieces in place? And what are we willing to do? And what are we willing to sacrifice as consumers to make that happen? And ultimately, these representatives are representing us. So it is our job to tell them. And I think that kind of gets lost in the big shuffle. We can't outsource the responsibility anymore. Right.
I think that's a really important point, because that was the one party not at the table. We're the consumers, the constituents. Right. And although they had, emails and other things that they were reading from businesses and other people that had been jaded, but it still wasn't a direct representative sample. And I think that's a good point. Maybe we should ask consumers and constituents, what they want and what they need and what their real issues are. And this is such a complex topic, because we freely give up data for a better experience. And so, some of that is just kind of in our nature, but I think there's a line and there's a blurring of those lines that happens. I mean, I always think back like a decade ago to the top cybersecurity issue of the time, and it was location-based services. It was like anytime that little GPS emblem popped up on your phone, you freaked out. There were articles on every major news site that said, cut GPS off, Big Brother's tracking you, all of that stuff. Fast forward to today, if Uber Eats delivers your food next door and not at your house, you get pissed off, you get frustrated. Because you want to give up that data for a better experience. And I think, part of the challenge with all of this is everything's moving so quick, and the pace of change is so exponential. And COVID-19 actually just accelerated things even more. There's new behaviors, there's new things that come in. But I think, that's a really good point around the consumer side of things. What do they need? What are they comfortable with? And, what makes them most comfortable using a service? I mean, we talked about this before, but I think one interesting move, everyone's had a kind of the crosshairs on TikTok. Yeah. And there's a variety of good reasons and rationale behind that. But TikTok did an interesting thing where they have announced they're going to open up their algorithm, and they're going to take something that's proprietary that no one would ever, dare open up, and they're going to make it inspectable by the world. And so
like they're sharing secret sauce and everyone's losing their minds.
Right. And some argue, this is a last ditch effort to try to stay in the US market before there's a federal ban. We'll see if anything happens there. But I mean, I think it's actually maybe a step in the right direction for the industry as a whole. And maybe that ultimate transparency is what's lacking and is what's missing, because right now as we saw in the hearing, it's just hearsay. It's, somebody that had a bad experience as a seller or as a user of one of those technologies, and then it's the company and their policies, and there's this ultimate disconnect between it. Consumers aren't represented, as you mentioned, but like transparency is just lacking from all of it. And maybe if we could inspect the algorithms and inspect these systems that people are so convinced, look at public safety, right? Like racial bias and AI and all these other things. If we can inspect those systems, then we know. Then we actually have a mechanism of knowing, and it's not just a back and forth hearsay based on, whatever the data is at that moment.
Completely. One, I think this antitrust hearing was such a good example that the old systems no longer serve where we are in the digital evolution. So just think about the antitrust regulation. How many decades ago was that written? And back then, of course, government was in charge of making sure that all of those pieces, were put in place. But now that process is just too slow. And by the way, I'm not advocating that government shouldn't be at the table. Please don't take that away from me. That is not my position. But it has to be a flattened, nimble process as opposed to what's happening now, because what happens now after this antitrust hearing, it went on for almost 6 hours, and other than some very well crafted tweets, then how does the public engage in that, and where do we go from here, and how do we shape that conversation? So I think we just need to completely dismantle it at the same time, being very careful that these are the issues of our time and they're not going away. That was the one thing that I thought was a very positive, but it's the beginning of this process, even though I'm not clear about what happens next, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, and I think you're exactly right. I mean, this has changed so much. I mean, you look at the last big antitrust hearings around, AT&T at the time, Bell Technologies, and you had, even that around Microsoft, and things have changed exponentially from those periods of time. And now it's going to happen even more so. I mean, there were 4 companies in the room. And you could argue there's a lot more that deserve to be in the room too, that are all kind of these quote unquote platform companies. But I think, to your point around kind of everyone's role, I think, it's not who's not at the table. I think constituents need to be more at the table, but I think it's also a matter of like, they need to step up their game. They need to do more. So companies that were in the room all were basically arguing that they're self-regulating and they're going above and beyond what's legally required in order to, try to avoid being a monopoly, to try to avoid unethical use of data, all of those things, which is great in theory. However, they're not going as far as they should. I think that there's an obligation for industry to also step up, not just to self-regulate, but also to educate government in the process of how best to do it. And for these agencies, that's, they've been dealing with COVID-19 response and everything else in the midst of all of this. And so regulating a very highly sophisticated platform-based company that has a variety of different technology. I mean, they don't even know the full gamut of the data utilization that these companies have. And the government, they need to step up too and invite that conversation and not see that as a lack of understanding or a lack of their own due diligence, but as just a part of the process. I think that there needs to be a little bit of that mutual sharing of how does this work. And there's been examples of that in practice before. I know we've seen regulatory sandboxes that have popped up, like in Colorado, related to ride sharing companies and other things, where instead of just saying no, you can't do that, and instead of the company saying, oh, we're just going to do it regardless, they have a mutually beneficial relationship to say, let's test this and figure out, like, are we a taxi company? Are we, not a taxi company? How do we fit into that? And I think, maybe that's the model we need to look at for more stuff.
Yeah, I love that, and cities leading the way. I love this kind of idea that federal government, of course, may be slower, but cities can be nimbler, and even the small cities can be the speediest speedboats of them all. And that it all wraps around this value set of transparency and authenticity and integrity. And I don't think that we can wait for a government institution or the media or the private sector or, again, this kind of pointing at someone to fix it. We have to fix it, step up, show the path, show the way that it can be done, put it into place, and then demand that others follow in that pathway. I agree with you completely. I like that, where that's going.
Yeah. It looks like we're solving world problems now. But I mean, I think that's
14 minutes. Come on.
Yeah, I think, but the conversation is the important part. And I do think, cities play a role in this too. I mean, this isn't, although the federal government, is largely been responsible for these types of things. I think, there is a notion that this is an all government issue, and this really affects, every level. And yeah, I mean, I think having the conversation to start is important. Looking at what other countries are doing, looking at how, some of these issues have already been dealt with in a variety of other places. And yeah, they have different government structures, but we can still leverage some of the learnings on what worked, what didn't work as a part of that. And I mean, just as a society, as a world, we're going to deal with a lot of really complex issues around, AI and around data use and around privacy going forward. And so, This isn't an Amazon or a Google or a Facebook thing. It's a worldwide dynamic that's going to affect everybody. And so I think the most important thing we can do is have a conversation, have these different players step up, be a part of it. I really like your point around the constituent side of things. I think that's the one thing that was really lacking, is just the data on where are consumers now? What do they need? What do they want? What are they most comfortable with? Yeah. And not just what is one super vocal, business that had a bad experience.
And how do we even quantify that? I mean, you can pay for research to say whatever you want it to say, fortunately or unfortunately. But how do people collectively provide their voice around that, and how do we capture it and kind of define policy around that too? I mean, I know that happens at the local level sometimes more successfully than others, but I think there's a great opportunity for like the open data communities, even at the local level. And where does that all feed up to? And is there kind of like a grand collective where that can be more streamlined?
I love it. Well, we did promise to keep these to 15 minutes.
We went
so we're at 16 minutes, so bonus extra minute. But as always, great talking to you, Chelsea. And for those of you that are watching in, if you've got other things that we should talk about, that's the platform, isn't just for us to kind of nerd out on these issues, but really to just start the conversation that, we're all thinking and that we're all trying to kind of grapple with for each of you. So we'd love to talk to you. We'd love to hear your ideas. And if you want to join us, let us know.
I love that idea. Yeah. All welcome. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon and see you next week.
Sounds good.
Okay.